Why UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse. John A. Keel. There is no plot to cover up the truth, but a sensible decision made by men whose minds have been boggled by just a glimpse of the overwhelming reality they encountered in their search for evidence to prove or disprove the existence of UFOs. We are now at Chapter 9. Sorry about the buzzing noise in the background. I need the fan on. I have MS, so... Anyways, some people have it worse than I do. A lot of people have it worse than I do. I have a relapsing remitting MS, so... But it's still fighting a good fight. The physical non-evidence, Chapter 9. Once again, the physical non-evidence. The amusing little mystery of flying saucers slowly evolves into a complicated series of coincidences and paradoxes as we plunge deeper and deeper into the data, excluding nothing and considering everything as objectively as possible. Our skies have been filled with Trojan horses throughout history, and like the original Trojan horse, they seem to conceal hostile intent. Several hard facts are now apparent. The objects have always chosen to operate in a clandestine manner, furtively choosing the hours of darkness for their thematic activities over thinly populated areas, where the possibility of being detected is slight. Perhaps they choose to remain aloof, or perhaps they are involved in long-range preparations for an takeover of our planet at some point in the future. This hostility theory is further supported by the fact that the objects choose most often to appear in forms which we can readily accept and explain to our own satisfaction, ranging from dirigibles to meteors to conventionally appearing airplanes. We, the ufologists, have really only paid attention to the eccentrics, the objects of unusual configurations. They undoubtedly constitute the minority, and probably are a deceptive minority. Probably a deceptive minority. Of all the paraphysical objects flitting about in our atmosphere. In other words, flying saucers are not at all what we have hoped they were. They are part of something else. I call that something else Operation Trojan Horse. Those students of UFOs who have made only a superficial study of the historical data have concluded that when ancient peoples encountered flying saucers or extraterrestrial visitants, they assumed that the phenomena were of a religious origin. However, when you really dig into the early literature, it becomes clear that the ultra-terrestrials deliberately conveyed this impression in much the same way that the mystery inventor tried to create an acceptable frame of reference for the 1890 to 97 flap. The phenomena is constantly reaching down to us, creating frames of reference which we can understand and accept. I think that these spirits that we're dealing with know that if we saw them, what they really look like, we would be frightened to death because they're scary looking. They are scary looking from what I've seen, and they're hiding that, but that's my opinion. Then Whenever we see something unusual in the sky, we accept it within that frame of reference and call it meteor, an airplane, an angel, or a visitor from outer space. The first step to understanding UFOs is to discard all frames of reference and try to view the phenomena as a whole. Our earliest religious and occult records fully describe and define Operation Trojan Horse. We have been told throughout history that ultra-terrestrials, or superior human-like non-humans, have been assigned to walk among us. In the Bible, for example, the prophet Zechariah states that he was visited by angels on May 21st, circa 520 BC, and that I saw by night, and behold, a man riding upon a red horse, and he stood among the myrtle trees that were in the bottom, and behind him there were reddish, speckled, and white. Quote, Then I said, "Oh my Lord, what are these?" The angel that talked with me said unto me, "I will show thee what these be." And the man that stood among the myrtle trees answered and said, "These are they whom the Lord hath sent to walk to and fro through the earth." Zechariah 1:7-11. Further on, Zechariah describes how he saw a cylinder-shaped object in the sky, and the angel informed him, quote, "This is the curse that goeth forth over the face of the whole earth," end quote. Zechariah 1:4. The angel continued describing how the object literally spy upon every human being. Until 1948, the religious frame of reference was constantly used by the phenomena. But as man's technology improved and many of our old beliefs were discarded, the phenomena was obliged to update its manifestations and establish new frames of reference. The phenomena, the phantom armies and angels so frequently reported in the past, were replaced by transmogrifications, which appeared to match man's own technological achievements. If huge multi-engine airplanes of the 1930s, Scandinavia type, had appeared over San Francisco in 1896, they would have created a frame far greater stir than the clumsy dirigibles which were used in the flap. By 1909, men had learned to build and fly crude machines, so the new transmogrifications of Operation Trojan Horse took the form of biplanes and carefully flew over the areas where the many soft objects were busily engaged in their mysterious enterprises. Still later, when the source of Operation Trojan Horse found it necessary to deploy eccentrics over Scandinavia in 1934, airplanes were carefully flown low over the remote, thinly populated villages so the people could see them clearly and have a frame of reference with which they could explain the many strange lights and searchlights in the sky. As with the early flaps, the true nature of the phenomena was carefully hidden from us. During World War II and immediately thereafter, the world's skies were cluttered with all kinds of man-made aircrafts ranging from helicopters to blimps. While thousands of UFOs were noticed and reported, many thousands of others probably were not. Cigar-shaped objects were assumed to be subchasing blimps. Strains eccentrics were regarded as secret weapons being tested. The cessations of hostilities gave the UFO source a new headache when, for some reason, it became necessary to revisit Scandinavia in 1946. A near hysteria developed. The objects were thought to be Russian rockets. The world was jittery, and the Cold War was just taking shape. If the ghost rocket transmogrifications modifications were used in other parts of the world, it was possible that they might have precipitated a new war. A new frame of reference was therefore necessary. We were now technologically advanced to a point where some of us, at least, were ready to consider and accept the possible existence of a superior intelligence with an advanced technology. We were a setup for the modern myths of extraterrestrial visitants. Beginning in 1947, the Great Flying Saucers frame of reference was carefully built up by a long series of spectacular instances and contacts. The whole structure of these events carefully follows the psychological patterns inherent in the early flaps. We were seeing no more and no fewer anomalous aerial objects in 1947 than had been seen in 1947. Okay, the anomalous aerial objects in 1947 then no fewer. Why did I say more? That's what doesn't make sense. Okay, let's try this again. We were seeing no more and no fewer anomalous aerial objects in 1947 than had been seen in 1947. They got that part wrong, or right? Anyways, I don't know if it should it be some other date. Anyways, so we were seeing no more and no fewer anomalous aerial objects in 1947 than had been seen in 1947. We were simply seeing them in a new way. Okay. A new game was being played with us. Small groups of believers quickly sprang up, and even though no one bothered to collect or study the hundreds of UFO reports from June to July 1947 to search objectively for the hidden patterns, these believers immediately accepted the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and they spent the next 20 years advocating the idea. And now it's like just pervasive. I mean, so you're fine. Good luck finding a group talking like this on TikTok. Their research followed a singular line. They labored to prove the reliability of witnesses. This meant that if the police officer or pilot observed an unusual object for a great distance, his report was given precedence over the report of an ordinary housewife who saw one land in her backyard. Some of these cults became obsessed with the search for physical evidence, but their criteria for evidence was very strict. Such evidence had to be non-terrestrial, but this was a vicious circle. If a piece of metal fell from a UFO and proved to be ordinary aluminum, it was discarded. If it proved to be made of a puzzling, unidentifiable alloy, it still proved nothing unless the source could also be proven. A new game emerged, the artifact or hardware game. This game is well known in the Irish fairy lore. The phenomenon has always obliged us by planting false evidence all over the landscape. The UFO cultists trapped themselves in the hopeless situation almost from the outset. If the UFOs actually were the products of a superior extraterrestrial civilization, the final proof could only come about in one or two ways. One, a flying saucer would have to make an error and crash or be captured. Then we would have absolute proof that it existed and was from a superior technology. Since 1947, there have been many rumors of such crashes. Author Frank Scully was told by a contactee type that such a crash had occurred in the Southwest in 1948, and that the Air Force had recovered the objects altogether with some bodies of tiny humanoids. He published this bit of hearsay, and it has become a major ufological myth. And the Air Force still receives letters from people asking if it's true that these bodies are pickled in a bottle somewhere in the AF archives. Number two, the UFOnauts must themselves come forward with the final evidence by landing in a public place in front of many witnesses, by entering into the direct communication with the head of states. There have been many reported landings, but as with the landings in 1897, all of these have taken place in secluded spots with a minimum of witnesses. The apparent purpose of most of these landings seems to have been to advance belief in the frame of reference, not to provide absolute proof that the frame of reference is authentic. After 20 years of this game, it does not seem too likely that such proof will ever be forthcoming. So we must content ourselves with an examination of the actual physical evidence which has been produced at UFO sites all over the world. On the surface, many of these cases seem completely absurd until we search for correlations in the other forgotten files. My own criterion is simple enough. If similar events occur in different parts of the world and produce similar details or physical substances, I feel it is highly unlikely that the witnesses in one event could have even heard about the others and could have concocted identical hoaxes. Instead, they were victims of the artifact game. We can begin with the puzzle of anomalous anchors. The following story is from the pages of the Houston, Texas Daily Post, April 28, 1897. Merkel, Texas, April 26. Some parties returning from church last night noticed a heavy object dragging along with a rope attached. They followed it until it crossed the railroad and caught on the rail. On looking up, they saw what they supposed was an airship. It was not near enough to get an idea of the dimensions. A light could be seen protruding from several windows. One bright light in the front, like the headlights of a locomotive. After some 10 minutes, a man was seen descending the rope. He came near enough to be plainly seen. He wore a light blue sailor suit, was small in size. He stopped when he discovered parties at the anchors and cut the rope below him and sailed off in a northeast direction. The anchor, now on exhibition at the blacksmith shop of Elliott and Miller, and is attracting the attention of hundreds of people. A small man in a blue sailor suit climbing down a rope from the sky. Rather silly, isn't it? Sillier still, researchers have discovered two identical stories in very obscure historical texts. An Irish manuscript, the Speculum Regale, so Speculum Regale, gives us an account from AD 956. There happened in the borough of Clora one Sunday while people were at Mass a marvel. In this town there is a church to the memory of Saint Kynorus, Kynorus, not Chin, Kynorus. It befell that a metal anchor was dropped from the sky with a rope attached to it, and one end of the sharply flux caught in the wooden anchor above the church door. The people rushed out of the church and saw in the sky a ship with men on board floating at the end of the anchor cable. They saw a man leap aboard and pull himself down the cable to the anchor as if to unhook it. He appeared as if he were swimming in air. The folks rushed up and tried to seize him, but the bishop forbade the people to hold the man for fear it might kill him. The man was freed and hurried up the cable of the ship where the crew cut the rope, and the ship rose and sailed away out of sight. But the anchor is in the church as a testimony to this singular occurrence. For many years, a church in Bristol, England, is said to have had a very unique grill on its doors. A grill made from another anchor that allegedly came from the sky around AD 1200. During the observance of a feast day, the anchor came plummeting out of the sky, trailing a rope. It got caught in a mound of stones, according to the story. And as a mob of churchgoers gathered around to watch, a sailor came down the rope and hand over the hand to free it. This crowd succeeded in grabbing him and pushing him back and forth until, according to the Gervais of Tilbury's account in Otia Imperiala, I guess it's Imperial. So Otia Imperia, another rare manuscript. He suffocated by the mist of our moist atmosphere and expired. His unseen comrade overhead wisely cut the rope and took off. The anchor remained behind as in the other stories and was installed on the church doors. Researcher Lucius Ferris remarked, viewing the similarities of these reports, one is almost tempted to speculate that someone merely updated the ancient accounts, yet a citizen of Merkel, Texas, possessing a copy of Speculum Reguli or Autia Imperia in 1897 would be as would be fully as fantastic as the reports themselves. A farmer 15 miles north of Sioux City, Iowa, Robert Hibbard, claimed a distressing experience with an anchor dragging UFO early in April 1897. A dispatch which appeared in the April 5th edition of a Saginaw, Michigan Evening News stated that Hibbard's reputation for truth has never been bad, and the general opinion is that either he had him or dreamed he remembered experience. The article continues. On the night in question, he says he was tramping about his farm in the moonlight when suddenly a dark body lighted on each side with a row of what looked like incandescent lamps loomed up some distance to the south of him at a height of perhaps a mile from the ground. He watched it intently until it was directly over his head. At this point, the skipper evidently decided to turn around. In accomplishing this maneuver, the machine sank considerably. Hibbard did not notice a drag rope with a grapple attached, which dragged from the rear of the car until suddenly, as the machine rose again from the ground, it hooked itself firmly in his trousers and shot away again to the south. It had risen to a considerable height, and the result, Hibbard thinks, would have been disastrous. Either his weight was sufficient to keep it near terra firma, however, or the operator did not care to ascend to a higher level. On the bank of the dry run, where the farmer finally made his escape, grows a small sapling. Hibbard passed near this obstruction in his flight, and as a last resort, grabbed it with both hands intently. There was a sound of tearing clothes, and the machine went on with a section of Hibbard's unmentionables, while Hibbard himself fell precipitously into the run. He related his experience to several neighbors, and despite their grins of incredulity, firmly maintains the truth of this story. We have only two choices. We either dismiss all four of these stories as being somehow derivative of one another, or pure poppycock, or we can assume that mysterious airships all dragging anchors appeared in 950, 1200, and 1897. Those are the years, AD, right? There were, in fact, a number of other reports in which UFOs were said to be dragging something along the ground. That still doesn't prove that the anchors are standard equipment of some of the objects. If they were using anchors, what could the purpose have been? Could some of the early UFOs have been so primitive that the only way they could hover was by being anchored to the ground? Would spaceships from another world require anchors? Physical evidence. All kinds of junk have fallen out of the sky throughout recorded history. Ivan T. Sanders has in his files extensive lists of documented cases going back to Roman times. Ridiculous things such as stone pillars, heavy metal wheels have come crashing out of the blue, and there are countless cases of ice falls, huge blocks of ice, some weighing hundreds of pounds, dropping all over this planet. Charles Fort and others have found reports of ice falls predating the introduction of man-made aircraft, but the popular explanation today, when new incidents occur, is that the ice has fallen from the wings of high-altitude airplanes. The flying saucers have been spewing all kinds of trash all over the landscape. In nearly every instance, these materials always prove to be ordinary earthly substances like magnesium, aluminum, chromium, and even plain old tin. Each of these incidents give the skeptics new ammunition. Here again, I feel that these correlated negative factors built into a definite positive factor. In other words, the more negative a piece of evidence seems to be, the more positive it actually is. We can start with a slag dumped from the sky during the Mary Islands, Washington hoax in 1947. Analysis of the material showed it to be composed of calcium, aluminum, silicon, iron, zinc, and other mundane elements. Heaps of this stuff have turned up since New Hampshire, Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and many other places following UFO sightings. It has often been found on hilltops and deep in trackless forests, places where it had to be dumped from the air. It was found in Sweden in 1946 when a wildly gyrating metal disc appeared over the city of Campinas. I think it's Campinas, Brazil, and on Tuesday, December 14, 1954, hundreds of witnesses recorded that it dribbled a stream of silvery liquid into the streets. Government scientists collected some of the stuff, and Dr. Resvaldo Maffei later announced that it was almost pure tin. The egg-shaped object, which police officer Lonnie Zamora said landed outside of Socorro, New Mexico on April 24, 1964, left behind a metallic material of some rocks. It proved to be silicon. Silicon substances have frequently been found at touchdown sites. Sometimes it is mixed with aluminum or other materials to form a purplish liquid. Such liquids have been found in New York State, Cherry Street, 1965, and dozens of other places. Witnesses in Texas, Maryland claim to have watched a shiny disk explode in the air in June of 1965. Pieces of it were recovered and were examined at the Goddard Space Flight Center. It proved to be ordinary ferrochromium. Another exploding UFO, this one at Ubatuba. I had a band called Ubatuba. Ubatuba, Brazil, in 1957, left behind particles which were nothing more than pure magnesium. The great quantities of tiny strips of aluminum, which with traces of magnesium and silicone, are now being found all over the world. Thousands of people in Chiba, Japan, reported seeing a circular flying object eject a flood of these shreds above their cities on September the 7th, 1956. Piles of it have been found in West Virginia, Michigan, and many other places during UFO flaps. It is frequently found laid out in nearly ordered patterns on the ground, with witnesses having seen UFOs hovering. I spent a lot of time investigating these cases in 1967. These strips are almost identical to the chaff dispensed by high-flying Air Force planes to jam radar. Yet they do not seem to be related to AF operations at all. The UFO chaff is often found under trees or on porches in places where it could not possibly have fallen from the sky directly. Quantities of it turn up in a burning field outside of Gastonia, North Carolina. So Gastonia, North Carolina. And in 1966, simultaneously with low-level UFO sightings, mysterious hollow metal spheres have also been dropped out of the sky all over the world. 3 such spheres were found on the Australian desert in 1963. They were about 14 inches in diameter and had shiny, polished surface. Australian scientists were baffled by them. On April 30th, 1963, Alan Bearhall, the Minister of Supply, appeared before the Australian House of Representatives and told them that all efforts to open the spheres have failed. The objects were allegedly turned over to the U.S. Air Force, and that was the end of them. Other metal spheres have dropped out of the sky near Monterrey, Mexico, February 7, 1967, Conway, Arkansas, November 1967. The Mexican ball was identified as titanium. One in Arkansas was stainless steel. Others have been found in Argentina and Africa. They do not seem to be rocket parts, nor would it be possible for a piece of rocket to go through re-entry and land intact as these things had done. Smaller colored spheres were found scattered over the French countryside in 1960 in 1966 and 67, as if it had been raining balls there. Where is all this junk coming from? Why? The answer is simple. From the same places that as the stone pillars and the blocks of ice from earlier times. Innumerable cases of contact and landing have been flushed down the ufological drains because of the deliberate, quote, negative factors. Sincere witnesses have actually been ruined because of the amateur UFO investigators have accused them of being liars or worse. Consider the case of poor Joe Simonton and his outer space pancake. It's a classic of negative factors. Simonton, a 60-year-old chicken farmer outside of Eagle River, Wisconsin, said he heard a strange sound outside his farmhouse at 11 a.m. on Tuesday, April 18th, 1961. He looked out of the window and was startled to see a silver metallic machine descending into his yard. As he stepped outside, some kind of a hatch slid open in the upper part of the object, and three dark-skinned men became visible. He estimated that these men were about 5 feet tall and between 25 to 30 years in age. They wore clinging dark blue uniforms that with turtlenecks tops, and had on apparently knitted headgear, such as is worn under crash helmets. All were clean-shaven, and some of them spoke during the brief episode which followed. One of them stepped to the hatch, Simonton said, and held out a shiny bucket-like affair which had a handle on either side, indicating that he wanted the farmer to fill it with water. Simonton took it, filled it with it from his pump, and returned it to the silent man. He noticed that the interior of the craft was black, like worn iron, and that one man was busy at some kind of instrument panel, while the other was working at what seemed to be a stove. A pile of pancakes sat nearby. Simonton says he gestured at the pancakes, and the man was with the bucket returned and picked up 4 of them and handed them to him. He then attached some kind of rope to his belt, and the hatch slid shut. John Simonton stood with his mouth open, 4 warm pancakes in his hands, as the object, which had been humming throughout, began to make a sound like tires on wet pavement, and rose slowly into the air, moving off to the south. At about the same time, an insurance agent named Sanvino Burgo was driving along Highway 70 about a mile from Simonton's farm when he saw what he later described as a saucer rising diagonally into the air and flying parallel with the highway. Eagle River is a thinly populated section of northern Wisconsin, just a few miles south of the Michigan border. It must have been way up there then. And surrounded by forests and small lakes. About a month later, on May 25th, there was a widespread power failure throughout the area, which also affected local telephone services. On February 24th of that year, a B-47 bomber had crashed near Hurley, Wisconsin, about 60 miles northwest of Eagle River. Another B-47 crashed on May 2nd, only 2 miles from the site of the February accident. The pilot of the second plane was later quoted in the press as saying that, "I felt this weightlessness. I was hanging by my straps just before the craft went out of control and headed for the ground." there was numerous other instances of UFO sightings in the area during that period, which was the lull from 1959 to 1963. So once again, we have a series of sightings and incidents which corroborate an unusual story, but unfortunately, we also had those 4 miserable pancakes. Simonton turned one over to the local judge named Carter, who incidentally vouched for his honesty and reliability, as did everyone else who knew him. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was given the second one, and the third went to the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which turned it over to a New York researcher, Alex Meebam. Simon held onto the fourth one. He said he took a nibble out of it, and it tasted like cardboard. Where the pancakes made out of exotic Martian mush? Of course not. They were plain old cornmeal, salt, and hydrogenated oil. Simonton's story got a big play in the national press, and NICAP capitalized on the publicity by issuing statements about their thorough investigation, which was underway, etc. But when the press interest died, the NICAP dropped the whole thing. The Aerial Phenomena Research Organization investigators stuck with it, however, and when an Eagle River businessman made a joking reference to Simonton having been hypnotized, he later denied this. Some leaped on that as the explanation. Cecil Hess, APRO's man in the nearby Rhinelander, Wisconsin, didn't buy the hypnotized theory. If I was ever a sincere and honest man, if I ever saw a sincere and honest man, it was Simonton, has commented. If it happened again, Simonton told a UPI reporter in early of May, I don't think I'd tell anybody about it. Simonton was a bewildered victim of the artifact game. Scores of contactees have been given pieces of junk metal, scraps of paper, and in many cases chunks of crystal or tektites, pieces of glass. The contactees display these materials almost probably as proof of their experience. One would assume that outright hoaxers would try to construct better, more impressive artifacts to support their stories of encounters with the wonderful space people. Another fascinating game, which the unfortunate play with a vengeance, is the repair gambit. Beginning in 1897, there has been an endless stream of stories and reports of many from police, officers, school teachers, and other reliable witnesses, describing how they encountered a grounded UFO and observed the occupants busily making repairs of some kind. In many instances, the UFO nuts deliberately get out of the object and inspect its underside with a flashlight. These instances have been reported in Italy, Australia, Scandinavia, South Africa, and the United States. The basic details in these stories are so similar that it seems as if the UFO knots are following a carefully rehearsed procedure. The superior technology of Operation Trojan Horse has apparently produced a line of faulty flying machines which constantly break down. Pieces of the damn things are always falling off where they can be grabbed up by eager UFO investigators. If the UFOs were real, it would be logical for a saucer to seek out a very isolated hilltop to make repairs. Instead, they prefer to land in fields of occupied farms and on major highways close to big cities. A 56-year-old electronics engineer from Temple, Oklahoma, William Eddie Lackton, became the center of considerable attention after he reported a bizarre incident in the gray pre-dawn hours of March 23rd, 1966 at about 5:30 a.m. on the bleak March morning. Lackton was driving along a deserted stretch of Highway 70 near Texas-Oklahoma border. On his where are we at in all this? I forgot. I said he said right now. Okay, halfway along the fuselage there was a porthole about 2 feet in diameter. It was divided into 4 equal sections, and there was a small door below it, measuring about 4.5 feet high and 2.5 feet wide. This door was open and white light was pouring through it. Directly outside the object, a human-looking man was examining the underside of the craft with some kind of flashlight. As Eddie climbed out of his car, this person turned and climbed up the metal ladder and entered the door. I'm sure it was aluminum, Laxton noted. When the door snapped shut, it sounded like when a door closes. He described the pilot as weighing about 180 pounds and to be about 5'9" tall with a light complexion. He was wearing what looked like a mechanic's cap with a bill turned up. I got the impression, due to his stooped shoulders, he was about 30 to 35 years old. Eddie said he wore either coveralls or a 2-piece suit that looked like green-colored fatigues. I got the idea that he had 3 stripes above and 3 stripes below on his sleeves. The above stripes were in an arc, and the below stripes were in a wide V shape. A few seconds later, the craft started up. It sounded like a high-speed drill. It lifted off the ground about 50 feet and headed towards the Red River. In about 5 seconds, it was a mile away. When the machine took off, Laxton reported the hair on the back of his head and neck stood up. Admittedly excited by what he had seen, Eddie got back into his car and drove about 100 yards when he came upon a huge tank truck parked beside the road. The driver, C.W. Anderson of Snyder, Oklahoma, said that he had seen something following him in his mirror, and that he had also watched it fly away towards the Red River. After their story appeared in local papers, other truck drivers came forward with reports of having seen similar objects along Highway 75 earlier in the year. Eddie Laxton faithfully reported the incident to his employer, the Air Force, and a couple days later, a line of jeeps pulled up in front of his office. A colonel and other officers wanted to see the spot where the object had been. Laxton said, "I went out with them and showed them the place. They asked me a lot of questions while their men searched the place with all kinds of instruments. They seemed to know just what they were doing." In the Air Force files, the object Eddie Laxton saw is officially recorded as unidentified. As for the man, Eddie claims, "He looked just like you and me. If I met him tomorrow in a bar, I would know him instantly." Among the great heaps of neglected and ignored UFO data, we find hundreds of many people accounts. These are very rarely published anywhere because they are so unbelievable. Many of them are identical to the fairy and gnome stories of yesteryear. The many people are only a few inches in height, some dressed like spacemen complete with transparent helmets, while others are described in much more the same way as Irish leprechauns. Witnesses to these events can experience conjunctivitis, akinesia or paralysis, amnesia, and other effects often noted by witnesses to more conventional UFO events. Many contactees admit that they have seen many people cavorting about on their furniture and even riding around in miniature flying saucers. Other of the strangest many people stories one of the strangest many people stories I have received came from a young woman in Seattle, Washington. In the latter part of August 1965, she awoke around 2 a.m. and discovered that she could not move a muscle or make a sound. Her window was open, and suddenly a tiny football-sized dull gray object appeared. It floated through the window and hovered over the carpet near her bed. She said she felt no desire to leap up or cry out as 3 tripod logs lowered from the object. 3 tripod logs, okay, or logs or legs, but it says logs, from the object, and it settled to the floor. A small ramp descended from it, and 5 or 6 tiny people clambered out and seemed to work on some kind of repairs on the object. They wore tight-fitting clothing. When their job was finished, they went up the ramp again, and the object took off and sailed out the window. Then she was finally able to move. She was certain she was wide awake, and the case was investigated by J. Russell Jenkins of Seattle. You can see why very few witnesses to this type of event could be you can see why very few witnesses to this type of event, would be anxious to tell anyone about their experiences. and you can see why almost none of these stories ever appear in print except in occult-oriented literature. Nevertheless, if we hope to assess the true UFO situation, we must examine all of these stories. We can learn nothing by considering only those episodes which are emotionally and intellectually acceptable to us. Fewer than 2% of the known UFO sightings are reported to the Air Force at all. Likewise, the various UFO organizations receive only a tiny residue of the data. It is most difficult to judge the situation at all on the basis of such small sampling. The problem is compounded by the fact that the majority of UFO witnesses and contactees tell no one outside of their own circle of family and friends. I have concentrated, therefore, on the hidden incidences and the little-known, seldom officially reported aspects of the phenomena. Individually, the sightings reports are nothing more than anecdotes. Thoroughly investigated, objectively reported cases are very rare. Even so, when you collect together all the available data, as I have tried to do, and view it quantitatively, you naturally expect that this mass of information will reveal some positive factors. Instead, an astonishing paradox is presented. The scope of the phenomena and the overwhelming quantity of reports negates its validity. The various UFO organizations and cultist groups and the few interested scientists had tried to deal with all this on an anecdotal basis, selecting those anecdotes which seemed to contain the best descriptions and had been reported by the most reliable witnesses. Thus, the actual scope of the phenomena has escaped them, and the best reports rarely contain details which can provide correlations with other reports. In short, the great bulk of all of the anecdotes are worthless and can provide little or no insight into the real problems. Statistical data which I have extracted and which I have tried to summarize briefly here indicate that flying saucers are not stable machines requiring fuel, maintenance, and logistical support. They are, in all probability, transmogrifications of energy and do not exist in the same way that this book exists. They are not permanent constructions of matter. Operation Trojan Horse has made us believe first in angels and phantom armies, later in mystery inventors, ghost airplanes, ghost rockets, and finally in the splendid Venetians. Because the scope of the phenomena far exceeds the limits of the tiny residue of known reports, we can learn almost nothing from studying the observations of a minute group of pilots and police officers. However, by carefully investigating many flaps areas in depth, I have come up with an alternative line of research. I discovered that the witnesses and the people living in these areas experience direct manifestations of a different sort. of a different sort. If we can put the witnesses themselves under our microscope, we may find that a wide variety of psychological and hallucinatory factors are involved. This is something we can investigate thoroughly and systematically. In 1897, the airships deliberately dropped peeled potatoes, newspapers, and messages at the feet of astonished witnesses to create and support the secret inventor's myth. In recent years, the same kind of objects have been dispensing strips of metal and globes of purple goo suggestive of machine oil to support the idea that we are being visited by, quote, a superior intelligence with an advanced technology, end quote. Some contactees have produced moon rocks and moon dust as proof of their experience on other worlds. But these substances have been discouraging like the rocks in your own backyard. The endless messages from the space people would now fill a library. And while the communications claim to represent some other world, the contents of those messages are identical to the messages long received by mediums and mystics. I do not believe that the Saratoga was real in 1897, nor do I believe that the aluminum spewing spaceships of 1957 were any more real. The engraved messages from the Saratoga were real. The aluminum shavings are real, but I would hate to have to go into a court of law and prove the reality of extraterrestrial visitors on the basis of such evidence. Since flying saucers may not actually exist as physical machines, we must study these people and closely examine the experiences which led them to believe that UFOs were real and extraterrestrials were real and extraterrestrial. The UFO phenomenon seems to be largely subjective. That is, specific kinds of people become involved and are actually manipulated by the phenomena, and in the same way that it manipulates matter. These subjective experiences are far more important to our study than the random superficial sightings. Like Canadian scientists Wilbert Smith, Dr. Coden, and so many others, we are obliged to forget about the meaningless sightings and concentrate on the claims and experiences of the contactees. And that is the end of chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the physical non-evidence. And what a wild ride this book is. And you know, as weird and as bizarre as this book is, from Keel, I think he's on to something, and we're talking about something that we call supernatural, we call paranormal, we call poltergeist, it's part of this construct, this matrix, this mind screw of a place that we live. It's bizarre. Why the hell are we here? Why the hell are we here? That's an important question. And why are we going through such weird things? Way to work at the Shepherd Air Force Base outside of Wichita Falls, Texas, where he teaches electronics, when a huge fish-shaped object suddenly loomed up in front of him. He jammed on his brakes, he said later, and pulled to a stop about 50 yards from where the object was blocking the road at a 45-degree angle. The thing was, he estimated about 75 feet long and 8 feet deep. Quote, there were 4 very brilliant lights on my side, end quote. He said, quote, bright enough so that a man could read a newspaper by a light a mile away, end quote. He also observed by the light, he also observed that it seemed to be lit up inside and that it had a plastic bubble in front which was about 3 feet in diameter, and we could see a light through it. It had a tail structure with horizontal stabilizers which measured about 2.5 feet from the leading edge to the trailing edge. Friends and associates have confirmed that Eddie has always been blessed with a phenomenal memory, and they believe him when he says he was able to distinguish a group of earthly numbers painted vertically in black on the side of the fuselage. He remembered them as reading either. I need to take a little break. I'm loving reading this though. And we are over halfway done.